So, permaculture broken down, simply put, it's kind of three things. The first, it's an ecological design system. It's a way of looking at systems and being like, all right, how can we make this A, more ecological, B, more sustainable? Simply put. Second thing is it's a box of tools, tips, and tricks that you can use to help you achieve the first goal. So it's a whole skill set that the permaculturalist learns. And then thirdly, it's a life philosophy, which I'm not going to really get into too much today. I'm going to give you a little, share my background of my journey with permaculture, and feel like everyone's life philosophy is theirs to find out for their own. And it originated with a fella called Bill Mollison and a handful of other colleagues in the outback in Australia. He was studying under Aboriginal people and learning from their growing practices. And from studying them, he learned these kind of patterns and techniques that really mimic nature. Biomimicry is the fancier term for it. And that's to say that permaculture is not new knowledge. It may have started in the 1970s with this person, but it's really a lot of ancient, traditional, indigenous or First Nation knowledge that has been given one critique. It's been given a new a whitewashing. That's what a lot of people say about permaculture. It's a very white-centric knowledge set, and also it's kind of been given a new label, new marketing. So critiques aside, it's still a very useful thing for us to learn from and kind of acknowledge that, yeah, there are some failings to permaculture too. It's not the sole answer, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. Permaculture has 12 principles, which we're going to get into in a short second. There's 3 foundations of permaculture as well, in a nice, neat little triangle. There's care for people, there's care for the planet, and then there's fair share. The idea being that we don't want to create one system where it's solely focused on caring for humans with an expense to the environment, or potentially with, an expense like only a particular portion of humans benefit from it, whereas another portion suffer. So the idea of fair share, we're making sure that everyone along the way is getting their equal bit. Care for the planet means to be more environmentally sound, and care for the people means to be more socially sound. Now, we heard it before that permaculture can be used in gardens. It can be used in agriculture. Indeed, the word comes from permanent agriculture originally. However, we can apply permaculture to many different aspects of your life. There is such a thing as social permaculture, where you can say you want to start you're starting a new company, and maybe you want to take some principles from permaculture and apply that to your company in how it functions. It could be designing how you cook your dinner and get rid of your food scraps. You can use permaculture methodology to help you figure out how to make everything as environmentally sound as possible using the principles. It can be used from anything from designing nonprofits to shaping governments to planting in your backyard. It really is a kind of multi-purpose design methodology. Now, the principles. So, observing and interacting. This is something we're going to practice in a short while, and this is really something that has become part of my daily routine when I come to work. Before I even open up this shed and start thinking about the day's chores and duties and what I need to manage, I will spend a good 10-15 minutes walking around and observing, and just picking up rocks, looking at leaves, smelling, tasting as well. These are all parts of interacting, and really letting the gardens teach me. We have all of these senses to take in this information, and just really being present and making that time to observe and pick out what we can learn is a great fundamental principle for helping us understand what's going on around us. And I think that's all I want to say about that. Oh yeah, even when it's pouring down with rain, it can even be sometimes a better time to get outside and observe what's going on, because there's a whole different plethora of life that comes out during rainfall. That's when the slugs come out and other insects come out that you wouldn't see otherwise. So normally when we might be hiding indoors, sometimes it's a good idea to put on your rain jacket and get outside and see what you can learn, especially if you're dealing with problems with flooding or seasonal pooling of water. Getting out there during the rainfall and seeing where it's all coming from can be a really great exercise in observation. Smell and taste is one of the easiest ways that we can recall memories because of how close the olfactory bulb is to our brain. And you probably all had those instances where a certain smell takes you way back. All of a sudden you're 5 years old again. So being able to connect smells and tastes to particular plants, even poisonous ones, probably the poisonous ones are the most important ones, as long as you don't eat a whole handful, that we can learn to identify these plants. And there's quite a lot of plants, nearly every herb that I'm growing here, I could probably identify by smell alone. Maybe we'll try this out as a fun activity one time. Okay, so number 2. So catching and storing energy. It mentions solar energy here. Let's think about this. How do we capture solar energy? Solar panels, it's a good example. Solar water heaters, yeah, the black piping on the rooftop there.
Different materials that we have, like I know concrete can take in heat or...
Great, so this is the idea of thermal mass, that there's some things like, for example, those stones over there, those 3 big rocks, I invite you to go and observe those and see how much warmer they are compared to the rest of the ground around. If I was to plant a tree in the middle of those 3 rocks, and I was to plant the same tree, maybe 10 meters away, the tree in the middle of those rocks would actually bud break sooner because of the thermal energy that's being captured and stored by those big rocks. Another way, let's think about Quebec, right? We have a pretty short growing season. What's one way we can extend the growing season using passive solar energy? Greenhouses, 100%. So greenhouses are a perfect example. Not only greenhouses, but cold frames, which is what we have behind me here, which are just basically mini greenhouses built into the ground there. Has anyone ever heard of an earthship before? Generally, earthships are built into the ground. Picture a hobbit home, if you will, with a greenhouse in the front. And I've been to these here in Quebec, where it is minus 25 degrees outside, 25 degrees inside, and there's no heating aside from the sun coming in and warming up their thermal mass at the back of their greenhouse there. So earthships are really cool, and they do work here in Quebec. Whether I'd want to live in one, I don't know. It's pretty damp and kind of earthy smell to it because it is a greenhouse at the end of the day. But there are a lot of other designs in warmer parts of the world where they work really well. And yeah, it's the idea of using passive solar energy to heat your house all year round, which is pretty interesting. And not overheat during the summer, which is pretty important too. Now, that's solar energy. What are some other energy sources that we can catch and store in our garden?
Like, does decaying matter count as energy? Is that
Most certainly, yeah. Okay, so decaying matter produces heat, yeah. It's also, if we think about what kind of decaying matter?
cover crops?
Cover crops, great, super. Look around us. What does Venier have a lot of on campus? Grass, yes, and? Trees, okay. Every year, what falls to the ground? Leaves. Every year, what is bagged up and shipped out? Leaves. Okay, so this is an example here. If we were a permaculture campus, none of our leaves would leave campus. They would stay on campus, they'd be composted in a corner somewhere and reused in the gardens to create nice, healthy soil. So taking a permaculture principle like catching, I did catch quite a few piles of leaves over there in the corner, so we do have a small amount going on, but it's really a fraction of what falls here. And we need a pretty big composting operation too to work with all of that, and it will probably turn Vanier into more of a forest than anything, which is what these trees are trying to do in the first place. So catching the leaf matter, catching our vegetable scraps and composting them, reusing them storing them as compost and then reusing them in our gardens to feed our plants. What else can we catch and store in a garden? What are some of the inputs in a garden?
Water.
So water, how will we catch and store water?
Rain barrels.
Rain barrels, great. So we have one on the other side of the shed over here. We have a rain butt there that's connected to a drain pipe. My eventual plan is to put one on top of this big pergola here and use that to feed our food forest with water. Having ephemeral ponds, so like ponds that are here during the rainy season in spring and fall, is another great way to catch it, so that we can use that in the drier season later on in the year. Water, I guess, maybe building water wheels is like another level of catching and storing your kinetic energy of water as well. What other inputs do we have coming into our garden? Animals. Interesting. How would we catch and store animals?
Attract them, so pollinators, flowers.
Right.
Food for certain insects that are beneficial.
Very good, very good. Yep. So creating food sources is one way that we attract pollinators to our garden so that they can eat the bugs that cause harm to our gardens, or they pollinate them so that we get our nice tomatoes. Another way to store them, which might be a bit harder to figure out, is to create habitats. So we have our insect hotels scattered around. A project of mine that I want to include in here is to put up bird houses as well. We have a distinct lack of like woodpecker holes that birds can birds can nest in. So this is something I want to include. I have a feeling there's some bird houses that were made by a class here once upon a time that are kicking around in a shed somewhere. So that's on my to-do list for sure, as well as add a bird bath at some point. So catching and storing insects and like animal fauna is certainly something we can do. And if it were my way, we would catch a few squirrels and store them in our bellies, but can't really do that too much. So at least not here. They spend too much time eating trash, I think, so that's too bad. Great. Some other inputs we can think about are harvesting our seed, like collecting our seed every year. We've just started our seed bank. That's what the billboard over there with the roof on top of it, that is eventually going to be a public seed bank where folks can come and pick up seed and take it home with them, and it's seed that we harvest from our gardens, as well as having a little donation box if anybody wants to leave some. And we could probably do this for another hour or so, but I'll move on to the next one. Number 3. At the end of the day, you got to eat. So being able to take something from your gardens is making it more sustainable. We could design this most amazing permaculture thing where we have to leave 100% of the stuff that's grown in the gardens and then we go hungry, and maybe that's not so sustainable at the end of the day. It also makes the point that some of these benefits are intangible as well as tangible. Like here, our main yield for this gardens is education, which we can't really, load in the back of a wheelbarrow and sell at the market, but we can certainly get a lot of benefits from it, even if it is an intangible thing at the end of the day. Very good. Number 4. Okay, so apply self-regulation and feedback. This is the idea that really it is learning from your mistakes and moving forward with it, as well as asking for feedback from your peers. Feedback can be in terms of how many tomatoes you grow compared to the previous year as well. Some examples I can think of personally where I've been like, okay, this isn't working. Shortly after I arrived in Montreal, I started farming. I rented land at an organic farm 25 minutes away in St. Basil in the South Shore. And I was using what's known as plastic culture, strips of black plastic that is used in wide-scale organic farming, in which plants are then put through the plastic, and the plastic acts as a mulch. It's a barrier to the weeds trying to come up. It keeps the soil humid, as well as protecting it from the sun and the wind in terms of erosion and drying up too quickly. And for sure, I got a good yield from my project. However, at the end of the season, I had all of this nasty black plastic, which some of it is biodegradable, but I really don't trust that too much. At the end of the day, you just end up with all these little bits of black plastic floating around in your soil. And so I said to myself after my first year of doing that not again. And I went for a more polyculture. This was after my PDC as well. I went for a more polyculture route, trying to grow living mulches rather than use black plastic mulch. And this was just an example of like something that I found wasn't working for me, and then being able to drop it, regulate myself, and move forward with something that was more aligned with my ideals. Okay, number 5. Can anyone think on campus? Are there any examples where they've gone from a non-renewable to a more renewable source here on campus? What's not sold in the machines here on campus? Bottled water, right? So a few years ago, there was a campus-wide push to remove bottled water. So instead now we have refillable water stations, and everybody brings their cups or bottles and fills them up themselves. So we've gone from single-use plastic to renewable containers, glasses, bottles that we can fill up multiple times and use that way. A great example of how we've done that here on campus. Here in the gardens, a nice example is our big, beautiful pile of wood chips over there. Wood chips are a 100% renewable resource, and we get these for free from a local arborist. Normally the arborists in and around Montreal have to pay for their wood chips to be burnt by the truckload, by the city. So we just got on the phone and spoke to 3 or 4 different companies, and then we found one guy who was willing to come here, and by coming here, he saves a bit of cash by dumping them on our food forest project, and we get all these free wood chips. And this is a great example of how we are kind of closing the loops. Rather than him having to pay to remove it, us having to buy in wood chips, we're kind of working together with our local community to find some free renewable resources. So, zero waste lifestyle. Has anyone ever heard of a zero waste store before? Some have, some haven't. They're fairly new. They've been here, 3-4 years in Montreal now. And the idea is that it's basically a bulk store. You can bring your own containers, and they'll have products which are normally sold in single-use plastic or in individual bottles. You can actually fill up in bulk. So my example, I live with 5 people in total. So we share our dry goods like our pasta, our flour, as well as some of our oils that we all commonly use. And so I have demi jars that hold like 4 liters or more that we go and fill up at the vrac store, the bulk store, every month or so to get our stuff. Rather than buying 4 individual liters of olive oil, I just fill this thing up from their big containers, and that way we get to save on a lot of waste as well. The question of cost was brought up, like, are you paying more by doing this? The answer is sometimes. I've found, it's my economics background coming in here, that whenever things are sold in smaller packets, they are often a lot more expensive when you take it out as like a per liter or a per kilo cost. Thinking of like some tea bags, for example, like, to give you an example, some of the most expensive herbs by the kilo, we're talking like ginseng is one of the most expensive. That can get up to $500-600 a kilo. And your little chamomile tea bags that you buy $5 for 10, like if you take it out and actually weigh it, you're getting close to the same price for simple chamomile as you are wild ginseng, just because of the quantity you're buying is a lot smaller. It seems cheaper, but at the end of the day, you're actually paying a lot more. Let's say I bought chamomile in bulk and then shared it out. It would be a lot cheaper than if I was just to buy these individual tea packets. And you know, you might be thinking that you don't drink a lot of chamomile tea, but pastors and flowers and beans, it all works like that as well. Like so, and a lot of these stores, like your common stores, have price by the kilo or by the liter. It's written on the barcodes, so you can actually do a bit of research yourself and have a look. I certainly have done it at a certain point, so you can kind of figure out that actually this is really expensive. It's only a 100-gram packet, but as a kilo, it's actually 5 times more expensive than if I was to buy a kilo or less, and from a bulk store. So something to think about there. Produce no waste. Waste is not waste until you waste it. The idea that there's really a use for everything if we're put our minds to it. I even have some friends who are doing local recycling. The idea that Montreal or Quebec's recycling system isn't great. It really, like, a lot of it is shipped out, and a lot of that is then probably not recycled properly. And I feel that, like, the whole idea of recycling in general is a bit of a fail. Like, it's like, so we buy this thing that we use once and then we throw it away for it to be taken to a huge complex, be melted down, and then be turned back into something else to come back. It's a very wasteful system there. Like, if we just bought things in glass, or if we're able to do consignments where we bring it back to the company directly, like, these are systems that we can actually kind of encourage to be a lot more sustainable. Number 7. Designing from patterns to details. I've done a handful of garden designs in my time, here being one of them, and people are always super enthusiastic. Like, one of the first things I hear is, my grandmother grew this kind of tomato, can we have that? And I'm like, sure, we can have that. Now let's take that's getting into the details. Really, the first thing you need to do is take a step back and have a look at the patterns. Like, what is it that would fit in your space here that you want to grow in? And in permaculture, we have quite a few different, like, garden designs. One is the keyhole. Has anyone ever heard of a keyhole garden design? Okay. Hopefully I can explain this without a board and a pen. So traditionally we have rows of vegetables. Now imagine the same space, and instead I put everything in a circle, and this is my circle here, and then a certain point to the middle, I have one footpath coming to the middle, and then I have a little circle which I can stand, and then in my circle, 360 degrees, I can reach over everything. And there's a good example where when something would need 40 feet of footpath, if it was in rows, in one keyhole diagram, and it looks like the hole of where your key goes in, because it's that similar shape, you only need 6 foot of pathway. So instead of 40 feet, you go down to 6, and you've got a lot more space to grow in. Sure, you may have to lean a little bit to get the things at the far side of your key there, as it were, your keyhole. However, at the end of the day, you're getting a lot more growing space and a lot less footpath. And I'll show you some examples of where our keyholes are going to be in the food forest later on. Another nice example of a pattern is the spiral that I have behind me here, this little construction in brick. The idea is that we water it from the top, and that's where the highest level of soil is. And as slowly as you work down, so does the water, and the wettest part is at the bottom of the spiral. So I would plant at the top your dry loving species, things like rosemary or thyme, which are Mediterranean herbs that don't need a lot of water, and then things at the bottom that love it wet, like chives or something along these lines. We can kind of mimic these microclimates just through copying a pattern of a spiral which we find in nature all the time. Another nice way to design your garden is to copy a leaf. You probably are all familiar with the leaf structure by now, being in this class. The idea that there's one main vein and then lots of little networks coming out of that main vein. So you design one path that is wide enough for a wheelbarrow in the middle of your garden, and then you have all your little networks coming off that are just wide enough for you to walk up and down in, so that you don't necessarily have to make them all wide enough for a wheelbarrow, and you've got a short distance to get back to your wheelbarrow when you're harvesting things. Very good. Number 8. Integrate, don't segregate. So this is the idea. Is everyone familiar with the term polyculture? Yeah, so we're probably aware of monoculture. This is one individual thing being grown at a time. Polyculture just means many different things being grown at the time. And the idea is that polycultures, diversity, whether it's social or in a garden or another system, the more diverse you have things in your system, the stronger and more resilient it is to outside risks. So let's say I grow one kind of corn and I have one kind of potatoes and a drought hits. My corn and my potato might get struck by this drought, or it might survive, but I kind of got a does or it doesn't chance here. And then if my crop fails, then all of my corn's gone, and same thing for all of my potatoes. However, if I had a dozen varieties of corn and a dozen varieties of potato, chances are that some of those are going to be a lot more drought resistant. So if I diversify my crops, if a drought or an insect or a frost comes along, some outside risk or outside shock, I'm much more able to mitigate that risk because I'm kind of, what's the word? I don't put all of my eggs in one basket. That's a really good way to describe it. With monoculture, all of your eggs are the same, whereas polyculture, you have many different baskets swinging around. Can anyone tell me, so we call them plant guilds, can anyone tell me here in Canada, particularly famous plant guild, referring to, yes? Corn, squash, and beans, known as the Three Sisters. Super. So this is the idea that of these three sisters, each one performs a particular role. Do you know what those roles are?
The squash covers the ground.
Ground cover, yeah.
The weeds, the corn lets the beans grow up it.
Yep.
And
And the beans?
well, they grow up the corn.
They grow up the corn, super. They also have nitrogen fixing properties, so they fertilize the corn and the squash. And Three Sisters is really simplified. You kind of need at least like 12 or 13 sisters to make a polyculture work properly. We had a beautiful example of one in our sports complex that we're going to be recreating again this year, fingers crossed. And plant guilds, I am slowly building guilds for each one of these fruit trees. So I'm picking particular herbs and other species that may attract certain predatory insects that fight bugs that grow on my apple trees. And then I'm going to plant some rhubarb down here that I can use to stop the grass from growing around the base. And the idea is that they're all working together to form healthier systems. Number 9. So out of the all of the principles here, I think that number 9 is probably the one that I have reminded myself of most often. Can't speak for you folk, but for me, I have a tendency to rush into things full steam ahead. This sounds like an amazing idea. Off we go. Here's my credit card. Let's make it happen. Whereas small and slow solutions is really something that I now repeat to myself to be like, okay, let's take a step back. We don't have to do everything tomorrow. And I think that especially not only with gardens, but with any kind of new project in life, burnout and just kind of wearing out your stamina is a real risk. Especially our generation and your generation as well. We have a lot of pressure. We're made to believe we can do everything. Just watch it on YouTube and off you go, kind of thing. And when we get into the nitty and the gritty, it's a lot harder. But then you may have already invested a lot to begin with. So starting small and slowly and observing and interacting and learning how to do things on a gradual level is it's a good thing to integrate if you can. So this is really much coming along the same similar lines as integrate, don't segregate. The idea that we can bring in diversity and allow it to reinforce and make our ecosystem stronger. Here it's one goal of ours to start a plant catalog and to slowly, we have a 5-year plan for our gardens, and I put in there as an arbitrary figure to introduce a dozen new species each year. Some of you might come up with some suggestions that could be good from your class here for us to take into account. But honestly, when I started working here, there were probably 30 to 40 different species growing here. We're now at the 50 to 60 mark, so we're getting there. Slowly but surely. And just the idea that the more diverse and the more different, especially biodiversity that we bring in here, Like we're facing a real threat to our biodiversity these days. So the more that we can encourage here on campus and spread the seed and share the knowledge as well, hopefully that'll all ripple out from here and have effects elsewhere. And in a very literal sense, like there's one organization in Centre Sud, Ville-Marie area, downtown. It's called Sentier Urbain. And they run the Place Emily Gamelin garden, so the one right next to Barry UQAM, and 9 other gardens around the South Central area. And in a very real sense, I can tell when one of their parks is nearby because I do walking tours. I do guided walking tours downtown Montreal, and I will start to be able to recognize like particular species that I don't find anywhere else. And then only do I realize that it's because their garden is on the corner of this block and I'm at the other end of the block, that it's blown in the wind or it's traveled on someone's item of clothing, that I'm starting to see these new species being integrated and spread because of the one park at the corner of the block there, which is pretty cool. Using edges and valuing the marginal. This is the idea that whenever there's an edge in an ecosystem, we experience more biodiversity. It's an opportunity for more life to happen. An example of this would be, take your classic pond. It's just a nice round oval. There's only so much surface area there. Now if we took a permaculture design to that, we would take this oval and we'd make it look more like a paint splotch. Like it would have a lot more different wavy edges to it, and for the same area we get a much larger surface area or circumference of the pond edge there, so we have a much greater opportunity for biodiversity to be introduced. Another example where I think this works is in a forest. If you're in the middle of the forest and there's a high canopy above you, there's not a lot of shade on the ground and there's not a lot of biodiversity because of that. Now if we were to build a road or a path through this forest and a handful of trees were cut down, the light that's coming in is going to create new habitats for raspberries or salmonberry or another plant to pop up that otherwise wouldn't have had the chance to exist because of that full shade color. So here in the gardens we have many different edges, like even the edge going from the grass lawn to the chain link fence. That's an opportunity there to introduce some vining species that wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity. And it's in my to-do list to get a pond in here at some point. I'm not sure where it's going to go, but we get enough water that I think we could have one at least for the spring and the fall. Number 12, creatively use and respond to change. Finally, change is an inevitable part of life. It's important to remember that permaculture isn't just about now, but about the future. We design for change, understanding that things will alter over time. The changing seasons, changing attitudes, our changing climate, how we respond to these will shape sustainable progress in years to come. These principles are a starting point for an understanding of permaculture and can begin to give us an idea of how we translate thought to action and transition to a more ethical and truly sustainable way of life. So a nice little example here of how we've kind of integrated change is due to current restrictions, we're not allowed to have volunteers here because we're not allowed a group of people together. So we said, well, what if we have volunteers come by themselves? So for Earth Week, we organized it so that folks could come, pick up gloves, pick up a trash can, and walk around and do litter picking by themselves. And we had volunteers come, they had a great time, we got a cleaner garden, we creatively responded to change. So, any questions before we move on to the next activity?